The first snowflake landed on Thomas Calder's ledger while he was counting oil tins in the storage shed behind the schoolhouse, and he did not look up. He had learned years ago that the first flake rarely mattered. It was the third day of falling barometers that mattered, and this was only the first hour. He counted 11 tins. 11 tins of lamp oil, bought with his own wages, stacked against the shed wall like a man preparing for a siege nobody else believed was coming. The town council had approved exactly 2 tins for the school year. Thomas had quietly bought 9 more from the Mercantile in Fenwick, 20 miles east, paying cash from his own pocket and telling no one why. Someone had told anyway. By the time he carried the last tin inside that morning, half of Ashford Hollow already knew the new schoolteacher was hoarding lamp oil like a man who expected the end of the world. 11 tins, said Orrin Bell, the blacksmith, leaning in the schoolhouse doorway with his arms crossed. Man could light every window in this county for a winter with 11 tins, or heat one room for 3 days without coal, Thomas said, not turning around. Orrin laughed, but it wasn't a cruel laugh. It was the laugh of a practical man listening to an impractical idea. Heat a room with lamp oil. Never heard such a thing in my life. You wouldn't have, Thomas said. It isn't done here. That was the truth of it, and it was also the reason nobody trusted him. Thomas Calder had not grown up on the prairie. He had grown up on the Cornish coast, the son of a lighthouse keeper, who spent 40 years tending a lamp that could not be allowed to fail, not for 1 hour, not in the worst gale of the century. Before that, his uncle had worked the coal pits, where men learned early that a sealed room in an open flame could kill you faster than any collapse, and that the same flame, handled correctly, could keep you alive when the world outside turned against you. Thomas had spent his childhood watching 2 different kinds of men solve the same problem. How to keep a small fire burning inside a small space, without the space, or the fire, killing everyone in it. Nobody in Ashford Hollow knew that story. They only knew the new teacher spent money he didn't have on oil. Nobody asked for. While 40 children, some walking 3 miles through open prairie to reach his one-room schoolhouse, depended on a coal stove that had already choked twice that autumn when the wind came from the wrong direction. The sky by noon had gone the color of a dirty dish rag, and old Henrietta Voss, who had lived on this land longer than anyone, stood outside her cabin sniffing the air like a hound. Feels wrong, she told her grandson. Feels like 73. Nobody remembered 73 the way she did. In 73, the temperature had dropped 40 degrees in 3 hours, and the storm had come not as a slow gray curtain but as a wall, visible on the horizon, moving faster than a horse could run. She had lost her husband's brother that year, found 9 days later, less than 200 yards from his own back door. By 1 o'clock, the wind had shifted. By 2, it carried the first real bite of cold. By 2:30, Thomas Calder, watching the sky through the schoolhouse's single east-facing window, while his oldest students recited multiplication tables, set down his chalk and made a decision that would either save every soul in that building or mark him as the fool who panicked over nothing. He walked to the door and latched it. "We are not going home today," he said. "Not yet. Not until I say so." Nobody argued at first. 9-year-olds do not argue with a locked door when the man holding the key has a voice like a closing gate. But by 3 o'clock, the wind outside had become a sound none of them had heard before. Not a howl exactly. More like the schoolhouse itself was being sanded down, plank, by something enormous and patient. The single window had gone white, not frosted. White, as if someone had painted over the glass from the outside, and through that white, the light coming in had turned the color of ash. 40 people were inside that room by 4 o'clock. 31 children. 6 parents who had come early to collect them and been caught by the sudden drop. 2 travelers who had seen the schoolhouse's lit window from the road and abandoned their wagon rather than push on. And Thomas Calder himself. 40 people. 1 coal stove, already burning low because the coal ration for the day was nearly spent. 1 chimney that had choked twice already that season. And 11 tins of lamp oil that 3 hours earlier, half the room had considered proof that their teacher was either wasteful or slightly mad. "We'll be fine till it passes," said Everett Marsh, one of the fathers, a broad man with a farmer's confidence in his own strength. "Storms blow themselves out. Always have." "Not this one," Thomas said quietly. "Not for a while." He did not explain further. There was no time, and explaining would not have helped. What he needed was action, and what he needed most of all was for nobody to open that door. The first hour of true crisis revealed the first true problem. The coal stove, starved for draft by a chimney already half clogged with soot from a wet autumn, began to smoke instead of burn. Thin gray fingers curled out from around the stove door and hung near the ceiling, and 2 of the younger children began to cough. Open a window, Everett said. Let it clear. No. Thomas said it fast enough that the room went still. Open that window, and in 10 minutes this room will be as cold as the ground outside. We will find another way to clear the smoke. He had already thought about this. He had thought about it for weeks, in fact, ever since the stove's first choking fit in October, and the answer had come to him not from any book but from memory. His father's voice, decades old, explaining why the lighthouse keeper's cottage had a shaft cut high in one wall, just below the roofline, no bigger than a man's forearm. Smoke rises, he said, mostly to himself, and climbed onto a bench to reach the small transom window above the door, a narrow pane, barely a foot high, that nobody had ever thought to use for anything but decoration. He forced it open 2 inches, not the full window, 2 inches, high up, where the smoke was already gathering. The effect was not immediate, but within a quarter hour, the gray haze near the ceiling had begun to thin, drawn upward and out through that narrow gap, while the cold air it let in stayed high, near the roof beams, rather than pooling around 40 pairs of feet. How did you know that would work? Asked Margaret Alsop, one of the older students, watching the smoke curl toward the gap like it was being pulled on a string. Heat rises. So does smoke, Thomas said. If you give it a door up high, it takes that door, instead of pushing its way out through every crack down low. The trick isn't keeping the room sealed. It's choosing exactly where it isn't. He did not say more than that. He had learned that a boy who is told a fact remembers it for a day. A boy who watches the fact happen remembers it for a lifetime. By 6 o'clock, the coal was gone. Not low. Gone. The last scuttle had been swept into the stove an hour before dark, and the fire inside had already begun its slow collapse into embers. This was the moment 11 tins of lamp oil stopped being a joke. Thomas had already built what he needed, over the previous month, piece by piece, without telling anyone what it was for. A slab of flat quarried stone, nearly 3 feet across, that he had hauled from the creek bed under the pretense of building a proper doorstep. A dozen tin reflector shields, each one a flattened, curved sheet of metal he'd shaped himself with a mallet borrowed from Orrin Bell's forge, borrowed under the excuse of school repairs, though Orrin had raised an eyebrow at the shape of the thing even then. And the lamps themselves, 8 of them, ordinary glass oil lamps, no different from what sat on every kitchen table in the county, except that Thomas had spent 3 separate evenings adjusting each wick to burn with the smallest, steadiest flame that would still throw real heat. He set the stone slab close beside the dying stove, where it had been sitting for hours already, soaking up warmth it would need later. He arranged the tin reflectors in a shallow arc behind 6 of the lamps, angled to throw their heat back into the room instead of losing it against the schoolhouse's bare log wall. He lit them one at a time, and as each small flame caught, he adjusted its wick with the same care a violinist tunes a string. 8 lamps, Everett Marsh said, watching. 8 little flames. You think that's going to warm this room? Not the room, Thomas said. Not all at once. It's going to warm that stone. And the stone is going to warm the room, slowly, all night, whether the lamps are burning or not. Nobody understood what he meant yet. They would. The temperature outside, though none of them could measure it precisely, had by nightfall fallen far past anything the county had seen in living memory. Henrietta Voss's memory of 73 included. The wind did not gust. It simply pressed, constant and enormous, against every wall of the schoolhouse, and twice that evening the whole building shuddered like a ship taking a wave. Inside, 40 people arranged themselves as close to the stone and the lamps as space allowed, the youngest children nearest the heat, older ones and adults, forming rings outward. Blankets that had come with the students who'd walked from home were pooled and shared. Someone produced a tin of crackers. Someone else found half a jug of water that had, remarkably, not yet frozen. By 8 o'clock, the room had stopped getting colder. It had not gotten warm. Nobody would have called it warm. But the punishing edge was gone, replaced by something survivable, and the youngest children, exhausted from fear more than cold, began to sleep. "It's working," Margaret Alsop whispered, more to herself than to anyone. Thomas said nothing. He was watching the transom window, and the small dark gap he'd forced it open. He was thinking about the thing his father had drilled into him as a boy, standing beside the lighthouse's own oil reservoir. A flame that burns clean gives you heat and light. A flame that cannot breathe gives you neither. It gives you a slow, invisible poison instead, and it kills you quietly, in your sleep, without a mark on your body. Every hour, without announcing why, he stood and checked that gap. Every hour, he made sure it had not iced shut. The second day did not bring relief. It brought a new set of problems, each one smaller than freezing to death, but each one, in that room, urgent enough to matter. The oil was burning faster than expected. 8 lamps, kept low but constant through a full night, had already emptied nearly 2 tins. At that rate, 11 tins would not last 3 more days, and nobody could say how many days this storm intended to take. The stone, too, had a limit Thomas hadn't fully accounted for. It held heat beautifully. By morning, it was still faintly warm to the touch, even with the lamps trimmed down to their smallest flame overnight. But it could not by itself heat 40 bodies in a room this size, once the wind found every gap in the log walls. And the gaps were the third problem. The schoolhouse had been built for autumn classes and mild winters, not for a siege. Around the door, around the window frames, along the base of the walls where the logs met the packed earth floor, cold air was finding its way in as steadily as water through a cracked dam. Thomas addressed this the way he'd addressed everything else that first day. Not with panic, but with the calm, methodical attention of a man solving one problem at a time, in front of an audience that was, whether they realized it or not, learning to trust him. He tore strips from an old canvas tarpaulin, kept in the shed for covering the woodpile, soaked them in a small measure of the lamp oil, and pressed them into the worst of the gaps around the door frame and the base of the walls. "You're wasting the oil," Everett said, though there was less certainty in his voice now than there had been the day before. "I'm not burning it," Thomas said. "Oil-soaked cloth swells and seals a gap better than dry cloth ever will, and it won't rot with the damp the way plain rag does. Every gap I close is heat I don't have to make twice." It was slow work, done by lamplight, with fingers going stiff from cold, and it did not stop the wind entirely. But by afternoon, the worst of the draft along the floor had eased, and the children nearest the walls stopped shivering quite so hard. Then came the argument that nearly cost someone their life. By the second evening, one of the travelers, a peddler named Silas Whitcomb, who had been caught on the road and taken shelter with the rest, had convinced himself the storm was breaking. He'd looked through a scraped patch of window glass, seen a brief lull in the blowing snow, and decided the risk of walking the half-mile to his wagon and the supplies inside it was worth taking. "I'll be back in 20 minutes, he said, already pulling on his coat. "There's food in that wagon. Blankets, too." "You won't find the wagon," Thomas said. "I know exactly where I left it." "You knew where you left it when you could see 50 feet. You can see 10 now on a good moment, and this is not a good moment. In a storm like this, a man can walk in a circle around his own front door and never know it. Your own footprints will be gone in 90 seconds. Silas didn't listen. He had his hand on the latch before Thomas crossed the room and put his own hand flat against the door, holding it shut with his weight. "I am not going to fight you for it," Thomas said, and his voice had dropped to something quieter and harder than anything the room had heard from him yet. "But I have watched men die 20 feet from their own porch in weather like this. If you open that door, you take that risk alone, and I will not send a single soul in that room after you to bring you back, because that would only make it 2 deaths instead of 1. The room had gone completely silent. Even the youngest children, half asleep against the warm stone, had stirred at the change in the air. Silas stood a long moment with his hand still on the latch. Then, slowly, he let it drop. 20 minutes, he muttered, sitting back down. "Might have made it. You might have," Thomas agreed. "Or you might be the reason Henrietta Voss tells this story for the next 30 years the way she tells 73. Nobody laughed. But nobody argued with him again after that. The oil was the real enemy now, more than the cold, more than the wind, more than the fear that had settled into the room like a fog. By the morning of the 3rd day, 4 tins remained, and the storm outside showed no sign of tiring. If anything, the wind had grown worse overnight, and twice Thomas had climbed onto the bench to check the transom vent and found it crusted nearly shut with driven ice, requiring several minutes of careful work with the handle of a spoon to clear it without breaking the glass. 4 tins. 40 people. No way to know how many more days. This was when Thomas Calder's knowledge, built over a lifetime of watching 2 very different kinds of men fight the same fight, proved itself in a way none of them had expected. "We reduced the flames," he told the room, gathering the parents and older children close to the stove. "Not all at once, and not all the way out. We're going to bank them the way you'd bank a fire for the night, low enough to hold, not high enough to waste." He turned each wick down until the flames were barely a thread of light, tiny blue-gold points that gave almost no visible glow at all, and he moved the stone slab as close to that small ring of light as it would go. "That won't warm anything," Everett said, watching the room's light dim to near darkness. "It's not meant to warm the room by itself anymore," Thomas said. "It's meant to keep the stone from losing what it's already stored, and to hold this room just above freezing until we can afford to burn brighter again. We ration the light and the heat the same way we'd ration bread. A little steadily is worth more than a lot, quickly, followed by nothing. He also did something that first surprised the room, and then, within an hour, earned a kind of grudging respect even from Orrenbell's brother-in-law, who had spent the last 2 days muttering that the whole scheme was foolishness, dressed up as cleverness. Among the supplies the families had brought was a small crock of rendered tallow, beef fat, kept for making candles and soap, that one of the mothers had packed without quite knowing why it might matter. Thomas took it, warmed a portion of it gently near the stove's last embers until it turned liquid, and added it, carefully, in small measured amounts, to stretch what oil remained in 2 of the lamps. Tallow burns dirtier and dimmer than good oil, he explained, working by feel more than by sight in the dim room. But mixed in small amounts in a well-trimmed lamp, it burns clean enough, and every part of it we use is oil we don't have to spend. It was not an elegant solution. The lamps burned smokier after that, with a faint animal smell that made a few of the younger children wrinkle their noses, and Thomas checked the transom vent even more often through that stretch of the night, aware that a dirtier flame meant a greater risk if the air in the room ever stopped moving the way it needed to. But it worked. The stone held its low, steady warmth. The room stayed just above the edge of true danger, and slowly, through that longest and darkest stretch of the storm, 40 people who had begun as strangers and skeptics began to understand, without anyone saying so directly, that the strange, quiet man with his hoarded oil, and his tin reflectors, and his stubborn insistence on a 2-inch gap in a window nobody had ever noticed before, had been doing something all along that none of them had the knowledge to see. On the 4th morning, the wind changed pitch. It was Henrietta Voss's grandson, half asleep against her side, who noticed it first, not because he understood what it meant, but because after 3 days of one unbroken sound, any change was strange enough to wake a person. "Listen," Henrietta said, sitting up straighter than she had in 2 days. "That's not the same wind." She was right. The relentless pressing howl that had held the schoolhouse in its grip since the 2nd afternoon had begun, gradually, to fray at the edges. Still strong, still bitter, but no longer that solid wall of sound. By mid-morning, for the first time in 3 days, someone standing at the scraped patch of window glass could see further than the length of their own arm. By noon, they could see the fence line at the edge of the schoolyard, ghostly and half-buried, but visible. The storm was breaking. Nobody cheered. They were too cold, too hungry, too hollowed out by 3 days of fear to manage anything as loud as celebration. But something in the room loosened, the way a held breath finally lets go, and for the first time since the door had been latched, children began to talk quietly among themselves, instead of huddling in silence. It was Everett Marsh, of all people, who said what needed saying. He walked to the stone slab, still holding a faint warmth even now, on its 4th day of steady, careful use, and put his palm flat against it. Then he looked at the 8 lamps, 3 of them still burning their tiny banked flames, 5 of them dark and cold, empty of oil. 11 tins, he said. You bought 11 tins with your own money, and half this town called you a fool for it, myself included. Thomas didn't answer right away. He was too tired for pride, and too aware that the storm outside had not fully released them yet. "My father kept a lighthouse," he said finally. 40 years, and in 40 years that lamp never once went dark, not for a single night, no matter the weather, because the one thing he could not survive was running short when it mattered most. "I bought 11 tins because I did not know how bad this winter would be. I only knew that if it turned out badly, running short would not be a mistake I could fix afterward." Henrietta Voss, listening from across the room, gave a short, dry laugh that had no mockery left in it at all. 19 years I've lived on this land," she said, "and I have never once seen a man think that far ahead of a storm that hadn't come yet." The wind fell to nothing by late afternoon, and the sky, for the first time in 3 days, showed a thin band of pale gold along the western horizon, where the sun was setting somewhere behind the last of the clouds. Thomas did not open the door immediately. He climbed onto the bench one more time, cleared the last crust of ice from the transom vent, and stood a long moment listening, not for the wind, which had gone, but for the particular silence that comes after a storm like that one, a silence so complete it felt almost like a sound of its own. Only then did he lift the latch. The world outside had been remade. Snow had drifted in long, hard curves against every wall and fence post, some of it higher than a man's head, sculpted by 3 days of relentless wind into shapes that looked, in the fading gold light, almost deliberate. The schoolyard was unrecognizable. The road was gone entirely, buried under drifts that would take days to clear. But 40 people walked out of that schoolhouse alive. Every child, every parent, both travelers. Even Silas Whitcomb, whose wagon, when they finally found it 2 days later, half a mile in the wrong direction from where he'd sworn it stood, was buried to its axles, and would not have saved him even if he had reached it. What happened in Ashford Hollow after that storm was not the kind of thing that made it into any official record. There was no ceremony, no plaque, no grand recognition. But something did change, quietly and permanently, in the way the town understood a handful of ordinary things. Orrin Bell, who had laughed at the shape of Thomas's tin reflectors when he shaped them at the forge, spent the following spring making a dozen more of the same design. Not for lamps this time, but as an idea he passed along to 3 other families building new cabins that year, each one placing a run of flat stone near their own hearth or stove. Understanding now, in a way none of them had understood before, that stone holds heat a fire has already spent, and gives it back long after the flame that made it has gone quiet. Everett Marsh, who had argued the loudest against opening a locked door on the first afternoon of the storm, was the one who insisted, when the town council finally rebuilt the schoolhouse 2 years later after it had grown too small, that the new building be given not 1 but 2 small vents cut high near the roofline. One over the door, one on the opposite wall, so that smoke or bad air would always have a way out, no matter which direction the wind was blowing on the day it mattered. And every lamp sold at the Fenwick Mercantile from that winter onward, at least for a few years, came with a small, unofficial piece of advice passed along by word of mouth from customers who had been in that schoolhouse or had heard the story from someone who had. Buy more oil than you think you need, and keep something solid near your stove that can hold heat after the fire itself has gone to sleep. Thomas Calder never called it anything grand. When people asked him, later, how he'd known what to do, he never spoke of genius or instinct. He spoke of his father's lighthouse and his uncle's coal pit, and the simple, unglamorous truth both men had taught him without ever meaning to teach it as a lesson. A flame needs to breathe to give you heat without taking your life in exchange. And a room that cannot let its bad air out will eventually let nothing good happen inside it at all. It was never magic. It was never luck. It was a schoolteacher who had spent his whole life quietly watching how other people solved the oldest problem there is, how to stay warm and stay alive when the world outside turns against you, and who had the patience and the humility to prepare for a storm long before anyone else believed it was coming. The 11 tins of lamp oil that had made him the subject of quiet jokes across Ashford Hollow that October were empty by the time the snow melted enough to see the road again. Nobody ever mocked him for buying them again. And for the rest of his years teaching in that county, whenever a new family arrived and asked why the schoolhouse kept 2 small vents cut high into its walls, or why a flat slab of stone sat beside the stove, where no one seemed to remember placing it, someone older would always answer the same way. That's the Calder way, they'd say. Built to outlast the worst day you haven't seen yet.